Hello, and welcome to the FinTech Times Presents series of webinars. Established in 2016, the FinTech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading FinTech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the FinTech world. So firstly, I'd like to say hello to our online audience. Thank you so much for joining us today as we explore cybersecurity and innovations in technology. So you can follow along our conversation on Twitter using the hashtag FinTech Times Innovation in Technology, or you can follow us at the FinTech Times. So moving on to today then, as our knowledge and use of technology continues to grow, this webinar looks at innovation in relation to cybersecurity, such as how in the B2C market it can be used to stop hackers, flag money laundering, offer financial education, or simply shop safely online. And we'll also consider the B2B implications, such as keeping company data safe, guarding against phishing, malware, or data hacks. We're also looking at the latest innovations within this sector. Thank you so much for joining us all today, and we're going to have a knowledge-filled session with our expert panel, who I am delighted to introduce. So we have Nils Gerhardt, the CTO at Utimaco, Arti Samani, CVP of Product and Marketing at iProve, and Simon Eyre, the CISO of Drawbridge. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining me today. I'd love to start off by having each of you just give us a short introduction. So Nils, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, happy to do that. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending where you watch and when you watch our panel today. I'm representing Utimaco. I'm the CTO of Utimaco. And Utimaco was actually one of the leading cybersecurity companies and providers globally when it comes to the root of trust. Our customers are banks, telecoms, governments, enterprises that use hardware security to protect them from cyber threats and then also to become compliant. So if you put this in a scenario, if you picture a smart city and all the technologies that you see in a smart city, it starts with 5G, digital health, but also automation in the industry, transactions in the fintech world, and then also the cloud and the data that you have to protect. You need some sort of root of trust, and that's exactly what Utimaco does. So in the end of the day, most of you have probably used Utimaco technology in the past and will do that in the future again without knowing that you have done so. So that's Utimaco and what we are doing.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Arti, why don't you give us an introduction next?
Sure. So, hello, I'm Arti Samani. I'm the Senior Vice President for Product and Marketing at iProve. So iProve is, it's basically on a mission to allow anyone we work with, whether it's financial institutions, governments, or other types of businesses, to verify the genuine presence of a user online. And what I mean by genuine presence is this person who is asserting their identity or verifying themselves in an online transaction actually present during that transaction or not? So how can you be sure that the person you are dealing with online is actually who they claim to be? And we do that using biometric face verification. So why do we use biometric face? It's because not only it's secure, but it's also inclusive. We carry our faces with us everywhere we go. And also our faces appear on the legal identity cards that are issued by trusted authorities like central governments, like state governments, etc. So that's what iProve is.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but not least, Simon, please could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi Polly, thanks for having me on here. So my name is Simon Eyre. I'm the CISO for Drawbridge. We are a cybersecurity software firm, but primarily focused on delivering solutions to the alternative investment market. So our clients are almost exclusively hedge funds, private equity, family offices, that type of thing. It was really born 3 years ago out of a need to fulfill requirements that were coming from the regulators like the SEC, NFA, FCA. And in the 3 years, we've grown globally. Our biggest presence is in the US and the EU, to about 700 clients now.
Fantastic, amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're about to have. So I thought let's start out by highlighting some of the key issues in cybersecurity. And first of all, let's look at this from a consumer lens. So what are we trying to guard against for consumers? Arti, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, absolutely. So from our perspective, the segment that we are operating in, which is assuring that genuine human presence online, we're protecting against three things primarily, actually. So things that affect our consumers directly, and that includes identity theft, fraud, etc., which has a huge emotional, financial impact. If they're not covered by the financial insurance, etc., there's a huge risk of losing a lot of money. For example, last year we did a consumer research where 30% of US citizens had been identified as victims of identity theft, and that's huge. So unless we do something about this to protect them, that is a big exposure that unsuspecting regular citizens going about their day jobs are being impacted. We also need to make sure we're protecting against indirect implications like money laundering. So money laundering is for most people on the street, it's just a buzzword. They don't really understand it. And it doesn't directly impact them financially, but actually the impact on society is huge. Imagine all the money that is being laundered to fund negative activities. It may not impact directly, but socially it has a huge impact, and the opportunity for the bad actors to create a negative social impact on countries, on the entire nations. And then the third thing, which is very important, is exclusion. So we don't often think about exclusion, but as security is tightened, the friction in access to services increases. And so there are segments of society who either may not be able to use technology very effectively, or they don't have the know-how, or they don't have the right equipment, whatever it is. Or there may be cognitive biases that seep in, etc. For a number of different reasons, segments of our society are excluded from service access, and we as technologists, we as players in the ecosystem need to take a responsibility for that. So at iProve, we take a lot of care of those three things. So protection against direct implications, indirect implications, and unintended consequences like exclusion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Arti. Simon, what do you think on this?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing with consumers in that many ways bad habits have sort of crept into our our sort of posture online in particular. And a lot of what I think consumers need help with is really some of the fundamentals. It's having good cyber hygiene, like not recycling your passwords and things like that. It can still be very fundamental. A lot of businesses provide their staff with cyber training now. They go through some sort of cyber awareness training courses. But when we see that, you're looking at those that are within the office. Those working in retail, those working in supermarkets, this type of thing in other industries aren't going to go through a cyber training course. They're not really directly using that computer, but it dramatically affects their personal lives. So I think with consumers, it's really being able to get out that same message. How can we educate them on best practices to be online? And it seems so simple and so, in that way, but that's where the focus is. And the real risk to them is that if they experience a social engineering attack, that they do compromise themselves and that somebody does go on to impersonate them and affects their banking, affects their credit ratings and these types of things. So it can be really sort of as simple and fundamental as getting that awareness out there for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting what you say about good cyber hygiene, because a lot of the time it is just going back to basics. Consumers,
absolutely, and it seems so simple, but I think for many people, particularly when you're in a corporate environment, and we all have this experience of working within cyber, that you sort of forget that there's an enormous amount of the population that doesn't really get their hands dirty in that sort of way, and that's the real missing piece for a lot of people.
Yeah, 100%. And then Nils, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, happy to. So Arti started with the identity theft part, and I think what is also important to protect for consumers is their assets. So That means, for instance, access to bank accounts, but also new things like, for instance, a crypto wallet. People have started to buy Bitcoins and then they start storing that value. And they also are likely to use that in an attack, for instance. So safeguarding assets is very important. And then at the same time, making sure that certain data will remains private and that privacy is maintained. That has a little bit of a tie also to all the services that they are using, but it also starts, of course, in their homes and how they use the phones and the devices they connect to all these digital services. And we have to keep in mind, and Simon was going in that direction, that a lot of people are using digital services nowadays, and they have never been trained on that. And the pandemic has created an unprecedented run towards digitalization, and so we actually need this training aspects to make sure people stay safe, but also all these safeguards that actually make sure that the identity is protected, that we protect the access to assets, make sure that's only accessible to that specific consumer that owns it, and then also the data is kept private, that you don't want to have exposed on the net, for instance.
And actually, if I can add to that, that point on pandemic is really important. So pandemic has almost it's created like a lab for fraud development. So people have a lot of time on their hands. The bad actors have a lot of time, access to great technology, and because we've had to do more and more things online, there's a lot of fertile ground for them to go and attack. So it's almost become, I think about it like a lab for development of fraud. And what we are observing as well is that the type of fraud, the sophistication of attacks is getting better and better, and it has got better. That advancement has accelerated over the pandemic. So one thing that we are doing is running a security operations center, where we have no idea how the next attack will manifest, but we've made very concerted effort to put processes, technology, and right people in place to make sure that we are able to spot the patterns of the attacks that have been built, even though we may not have seen them ever before. But that means that we are then able to respond to them very quickly and close whatever the vulnerability gaps may be identified. So as attacks are built, we are able to build defenses in real time. And this is actually something that is kind of we had this in place already, but the pandemic has really highlighted the importance of being able to spot not yet seen attacks.
Fantastic, yeah. So if we can move on and let's look at things from more of a B2B focus. So what are we guarding against for businesses? What are the key issues there? Simon, I don't know if you want to take this one first.
Yeah, so I suppose with businesses, it moves on. Obviously, you still have to worry about your staff and your customers' personal data. But as a business, I think one of the additional factors that we've seen a lot of in the recent months or perhaps even the past couple of years have been the ransomware attacks. So that really affects the availability of your business. Your online presence can be dramatically affected by a ransomware attack. And so guarding against that type of thing, and obviously the actual ransomware attack is the end result of what's happened there. So what you're guarding against there is, again, social engineering on staff, but also vulnerabilities within the platform. We've seen the news recently about Log4j, for example, a very potentially large exposure across the internet to a zero-day vulnerability for websites and web services and web applications. And so these are all good examples. Businesses have to take this to another level of protection, the greater their online presence in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nils, what did you think on this one?
Yeah, so to add to what Simon said, I think what is really important for businesses is to protect the IP and the data that you create. And I think this is really one thing that you have to make sure is done in the right way. And then the second aspect is the manufacturing capabilities. So if you produce goods, you need to make sure that your company is running and that your infrastructure is secured. And you also have to protect people, because the more things we connect, the more likely it is as well to potentially create here some sort of issue where a machine, for instance, get controlled by an attacker and might even have the ability to physically harm people. So you also have to protect your employee base. So there's a lot of things that you have to protect from a company perspective, and ransomware is definitely a very good example of where the threats come from a company perspective. So that's really something where the company also has to look at how do you protect your business when everything is opening up. So you have suddenly your workforce that works from home. You have a lot of endpoints out there that you have to control from a company perspective, and making sure that you combine all that, all these endpoints, your corporate network, the closed network, the cloud, and also the cloud providers. This is really the challenge from a business perspective, to make sure that you have the adequate security and providing the flexibility to have your company growing and working in an efficient way, not only in the pandemic, but also, I mean, the digitalization will continue also after the pandemic. I'm sure about that. And that's really something that you need to prepare your company for.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And then Artie, coming to you, what do you think about this?
Yeah, so echoing everything that's been said, but in addition, businesses are exposed to a lot of financial loss at the moment. For example, again, going back to pandemic, there are a lot of relief programs in place. So in the United States, $100 billion worth of money has been stolen just from the pandemic relief program. So when they work with security organizations, when governments and other businesses work, the one thing that we are able to do is to protect them from financial loss, or at least minimize the financial loss, because we can guard against fake identities, against other type of fraud and threat that goes out. There's also the other part for regulated sectors specifically, is the fines and penalties from the regulators. So, last year FCA wrote an open letter to the UK banks to say, you need to up your game to stop money laundering, etc., or to spot money laundering. So when again, it's the responsibility of vendors, technologists like this group, where we have to put systems and processes in place to make sure that they're protected against fines, they're protected against financial loss and other types of interceptions. So to the point earlier, where there are many endpoints now when we are working from home, most employees do not like to use work devices because they feel like they are being they're exposed to surveillance from their employers. So when people are using their own devices and multiple devices, how do we protect that, and therefore how do we protect their businesses?
I think there's one thing to add, which makes also the company a little bit different than the consumer space. It is protecting them also for like compliance reasons and from legal fines. I think this is one of the things that usually don't apply so much in the consumer space, but it's something with GDPR and some of these new regulations that become more and more important for companies, so they make sure they are compliant in regards to the new legislation that is out there. And that's really also the industry's efforts to make sure that everyone is compliant in terms of cybersecurity.
Absolutely fantastic, thank you so much. So moving on then, this is probably the big money question and what we've come here to talk about the webinar. But what would you say have been the real innovations in cybersecurity over the recent months and even recent years? Obviously, we've been talking a lot about the pandemic, which I imagine has really shifted things along. But what are the innovations that we're seeing currently in the? So Artie, why don't you answer that one first?
So from my perspective, I'll talk, it's less about innovation, more about adoption of cloud infrastructure. So a lot of security now is moving and has moved to cloud, and there is a lot of acceptance by businesses to adopt cloud-based security, which didn't exist even as recently as 3 years ago when we were talking with our prospects. They were very averse to adopting cloud-based securities, but now that sentiment is changing. And the reason this is important is because it reduces the time of exposure to a vulnerability. So no security system is ever 100% secure 100% of the time. That static security, those days are gone. Like I said earlier, the threat is evolving, and therefore security needs to evolve to keep up with the new types of threat that emerge in the market. Now, if we didn't have a cloud-hosted security solutions, the vendors, so iProof, for example, would have to wait until they were alerted that someone has been hacked somewhere. We would then have to go and create a solution. We would deploy the solution. We would expect the business to then push it out to their users. And ultimately, the end user has to upgrade their system to protect themselves. That could take forever. It could take days, weeks, months, right? And during that entire period, the end user who's completely innocent, unsuspecting, is left exposed. So the adoption of cloud-based security and the sentiment change to accept cloud-based security, for me, from my perspective, is a huge step forward.
Absolutely. And I feel like cloud is such a huge buzzword everywhere in the industry at the moment. I think not a day goes by where something about the cloud doesn't pass over my desk. Nils, why don't you go next? What innovations are you seeing at the moment?
I think there are a couple of innovations that really have made a difference over the last years. I think one is the topic of AI, in particular when you relate this to financial transactions. The ability to reduce fraud, to detect patterns, and give risk scoring in basically real time. That's really an innovation that has helped the industry to reduce risk in this specific case of financial institutions, but also in other areas. And then what is also very important from my perspective, and what will also, I think, further develop, is virtualization. The ability to not work on a physical system, but rather to segregate and make sure every user has only a virtual space to work on, and then you basically keep that separate from the hardware. And then thirdly, the concept, the mindset change from basically from the past saying you have access to a VPN, so you must be authorized, you get access to all the company documents and systems, but rather going to a zero trust approach and combining that with sophisticated technologies to guard from an endpoint perspective, making sure that you protect the mobile as much as the laptop and the company infrastructure when you work from within the company, with concept like SASE, for instance. These are really the core concepts that I think have upped security significantly in the recent months and years, and helped the industry to come to a point to manage the security also in this really huge digitalization wave that we're facing right now.
Fantastic. And then Simon, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's going to echo Artie and Nils quite a lot here with my thoughts on this. But I think one of the key changes that we have seen is this very traditional network perimeter style environment, a sort of physical office environment, really dissolve away. And that's meant that security has moved, just as Nils was describing, really to the endpoint and this sort of zero trust identity-based security rather than a trusted network perimeter. That's been a very significant change. And that's meant that a lot of the traditional security features like web filtering and these types of things have moved away from network appliances to endpoints. So that's been a really big shift. And it's a key one to being able to do this dispersed workforce that many companies have adopted now. There's no question that the speed and the development that's happening in the cloud, it far outweighs what you could traditionally do with sort of on-site tin products as well. So there's the depth of development and the new functions and features from a cybersecurity perspective that are available on the public cloud models is really fantastic. And I think lastly, because of this move to cloud, we're also starting to see better capabilities of collaboration between different cybersecurity products. So your antivirus, your anti-malware, your web filtering, your authentication, they're all starting to be able to talk to each other in sort of next-gen SIEM and some even sort of managed SOC solutions, so that they can really see, oh, maybe we had a vulnerability here, and that's led also to multiple authentication failures. And machine learning's kicking in as well, a bit like the AI that Nils was saying. It's not just simply a threshold is broken now, but we're starting to see models of, where these types of things, different activities from different systems are being able to collectively track together.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And then sort of just following on from this, I guess the question I wanted to ask you all is, when cybersecurity fails, when it does fail, what is the real life impact, and how are companies and products making strides to fight this? And I guess, how are these innovations that you've all just talked about, how are these innovations fighting this, and what innovations might we see cropping up to help with this scenario as well? Niels, I'm going to come to you first for this one.
Yes. So that's a very interesting question. I mean, failing safeguards can mean anything from reputational loss to monetary loss, but potentially also harm to people. I mean, we work a lot with companies and also government agencies that have critical infrastructure, and that is in the energy space or in the healthcare industry. And I mean, if something fails there, that actually could potentially cause harm to people or even cause death. And that's really something where safeguarding becomes really important, to make sure that there is no attack possible, because all the systems will eventually connect. I mean, the benefits of cloud and the technology advances is something that you will see in all the industries, including also the critical infrastructure. And if you look at technology, we are kind of tied up with thinking about all the challenges we face today, and we don't really look towards what is coming. And an example is topics like 6G, while we still have not fully specified 5G as an example, as a technology. And then another one is, for me, the development of quantum computing. We rely on our cryptography that we have in place for years, and which is completely safe today. But in the future, that might change with quantum computers. And companies think they have a couple of years to prepare and do that assessment tomorrow when quantum computers are powerful enough. But what you have to keep in mind is you might have data that has to be secured for the next 20 years. And if that data is captured today, then it might be exposed in 10 or 15 years from now when quantum computers are powerful enough to break today's cryptography. And this is really something where we have to think ahead what is coming, and trying to also make companies aware that topics that will come in, let's say, 10 or 15 years have an impact on their data today. And that's really one of the things where I think we need to focus on. Once we have managed to get on top of all these topics around digitalization, securing the cloud, making sure your data is safe in cloud environments. And that's really what we focus on. This is why Utimaco is focusing so much on providing the root of trust. The root of trust really is the basis for all these digital use cases. And you also find the technology, for instance, today that protects you in the future against quantum computing attacks on cryptography. And this is really one of the things that you need to build digital use cases for the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Niels. Simon, what did you think on this question?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you look at sort of the very highly publicized attacks that you see, things like SolarWinds or the Colonial Pipeline. You think that cyber attacks really affect just the large corporations, and perhaps from a sort of persistent type attack where they're going after a business in a specific target. That's true. But unfortunately, the vast majority of attacks really affect the sort of small and medium businesses, and it's the sort of ransomware type things like that happen. And so failing or falling victim of a cyber attack is really affecting these smaller companies, and they can wipe out years and years of data in doing this with, if they don't have their proper backup strategies in place or redundant systems and the resilience that a business truly needs to survive one of these attacks. So it can really affect the smaller business, and I think that's the unfortunate thing that perhaps doesn't come across in many of the types of attacks that we see. It's one thing for SolarWinds to fall victim to this and then survive and perhaps even come out stronger with a better cybersecurity posture, but it can wipe out smaller businesses. So there really needs to be a better understanding and a better promotion for the small people. And just one thing that Niels mentioned, sort of slightly off topic, is the sort of 5G to 6G. I think an interesting one along these lines of what would happen if something failed in the future. 5G and 6G have been connected with the idea of more driverless cars, sort of more autonomous driving in situations. And I think for that to happen, I mean, the requirements to ensure that that's a truly secure environment with manufacturers and road logistics and everything being tied together. You know, I find that very interesting. I'm very interested in motors and cars and the auto industry anyway, but to see how that will come together with cybersecurity would be really interesting.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Simon. And then finally, Artie, what did you think on this one?
Yeah, so keeping in the same thread of looking at small businesses, on the other side, it's looking at people who desperately need access to services. If there was ever a cybersecurity fail and people's identities were stolen, synthetic identities were created, what it actually does, it cuts out the lifeline for people who need access to financial services quite desperately, especially in emerging markets, underdeveloped markets like some parts of Asia, some parts of Africa. I'll give you an example of Uganda. I'm dealing with a bank in Uganda at the moment where I'm trying to close a long-standing family account. Now, it's a small bank, but they are rightly creating a lot of friction for me to close the account, to the point they're saying, you have to come to Uganda to close this. I'm not able to travel, it's pandemic, etc. So it's created friction for me and it's frustrating. On the other hand, they are doing the right thing. They are protecting me, their user, to make sure that I am not a victim of identity theft. So it's because if my identity was stolen and if a bad actor tried to access the account and close the account, etc., 3 generations of family would be stopped from receiving the inheritance from their forefathers. Now that's not a huge big problem, but imagine the same thing happened to local people who were using that same bank in order to, which is their lifeline to support their family, to pay their bills, to pay their rents, etc. They would be cut off from these services, and it becomes a survival issue. It's basically a life and death issue. So when cybersecurity fails, the impact is very, very real, and it becomes it's an extinction problem, existence problem for people in some parts of the world. So we have to take that very seriously. And what are companies and products doing to fight it? Well, as the example in this bank, they are putting more and more stringent measures in place. They're looking at different ways of authentication, how many factors, we talk about multi-factor authentication a lot, but how many factors can one add, etc. In the process, there's a lot of friction that is added, and therefore vendors and players in this ecosystem are working hard to see how we can turn that on its head so that bad actors do get friction and they're not able to get where they want to. But on the other side, genuine people are actually able to access whatever they need to access in a very secure way.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our webinar and we are running out of time. However, I want to ask you all one more question. I'd love to just look ahead very briefly to the future. What do you guys think the future of the industry is going to be? What are the key issues going to be for the future, or what are the innovations coming next? I'd just love to hear your thoughts about the next 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. So Simon, I'm going to ask you this one first, the future.
Yeah, sure. I think we'll start to see perhaps a little bit more regulation on the help that needs to be given to consumers. If we're sort of focused on the consumer side of things, I could imagine banks, and you do see this with some of the consumer banks anyway, offering sort of antivirus products to download to your computer to do online banking and use those tools. But an expansion into that, maybe it does become with education programs, maybe it comes with the tools like password managers. I think we'll see more of an adoption of these, the technologies that we sort of already see in the office, in the business world, become a bit more mainstream. So I think that would be really good to see pushed out there. For businesses, I think with the move to cloud, and I think that, again, sort of mentioned this earlier, but the collaboration side of things is really starting to pick up. I think we still have disparate systems that aren't necessarily talking to each other. And as that progresses and as we start to get more of these, the exchange of information about what's happening. That'll improve just a general outflow of breaches and things like that, and being able to block known credentials, for example, that type of thing. I imagine we'll see a lot more of that pick up.
Fantastic, thank you. And Artie, what do you think on the future?
Yeah, so I expect to see much higher adoption of biometrics. So today we use it, but we still don't use it to the extent that it has the capability of helping us as consumers and becoming mainstream. So I see biometrics playing a big part in the future, in relation to, again, reducing that friction. So if you think about how frictional passwords are today, I'm changing my password on a weekly basis in different areas. It's just not sustainable to work in this way. So how do we simplify it? And therefore biometrics play a big part in it. The other place I see the industry going is in the consumers, the person taking more control of their identity and only giving out the credential that they want to give out and is absolutely necessary. So currently, if we are applying for a mortgage, we have no choice. We have to supply a whole bunch of information, which we don't know how it will be used, what hands it's going into, etc. Future, I anticipate more of that control to me. So being able to say, all right, for this service, for me to access this service, you only need to know my name and date of birth. You don't actually need my address. So I want to only release those two credentials, and I will choose which credentials and how I release them to you. So that whole verifiable credential space, I think, will pick up a lot. So giving more control to the person, to the individual about their identity and how it is released to third parties.
Fantastic, thank you. And Nils, what do you think?
I definitely believe as well, like Artie said, that everything will have some sort of identity. It doesn't matter whether it's a device or person, and that is actually one of the things that will definitely develop. But what I also think is we will continue to push the boundaries of technology, and we see people trying to do things that are not possible today. Like who had thought that we would fly tourists to space with private companies that had that as a business model, and they worked on that for actually not too many years, if you think back the time when everything started. And I think this will continue. And so people will push for quantum computing to make sure that we also go beyond the boundaries of today's computing power. And it's the same thing for memories and for all these technology components. Now, this is on the positive side, because it will help. And with all the digitalization, the exchange of knowledge, of progress will actually help creating these new use cases and these new technologies. But this will also not stop the attackers from doing the same. And if you see models like that you can basically attack companies as a service, so you get a platform and then people help you to attack, for instance, a company. All these aspects of attacking will also, in the same way, evolve and basically attack the new technologies that we see out there. So I think going forward, it is really up to the industry to make sure we find ways to protect this in an adequate way, and making sure that these technologies can be used in a secure and safe way, and that the exchanges and all the technologies like the cryptography of today will remain secure and will evolve to make sure that we have the same data protection and the same safeguarding of identities and assets for consumers and for businesses that we have today and that we need in the future.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much to our online audience for watching, and don't forget you can follow along the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag FinTech Times Innovation in Technology, and you can follow us at the FinTech Times as well. And thank you so much to my guests today, Nils, Simon, Artie. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure to have you, and I've really enjoyed hearing your insights. And I hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much.